Good afternoon. Welcome to Robert Sungenis Live, this time for December the 18th in the year of our Lord 2024. Just a few days to go before 2025. So glad you could be with us today. As you know, this program is set aside for you to ask your questions, give your comments on any topic whatsoever. And in my role as host of this program, I will endeavor to answer your questions to the best of my ability using our Catholic faith, tradition, scripture, the saints, the doctors, the popes, the councils, and just about anything I can find to help you walk away satisfied that your question has indeed been answered. We come to you every Wednesday from 3 to 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And usually at the top of the program, I have some email questions to answer, and we just have a few today. So get ready to ask your questions on the board. And there's just two rules we have for submitting your question. And the first is to put your question, the word question, in capital letters before your question so that I know it's a question when I scroll down. And the second one is very simple. Be kind to your fellow chat members. And let me see. So let's get right to the email questions, see if we can get through these faster than I've done before so that I leave time for anybody who hasn't had the opportunity to ask a question but wants to, has that ability to get on. Okay, so let's deal with the first question. Greetings, Dr. Sungenis. Please, can you explain the curse and the mark of Cain? Thanks and God bless. Paul. Okay, so Cain's always an intriguing story because it's rather short, and we don't know anything else about Cain and Abel except that when they got older, one apparently got jealous of the other and killed him, and then he complains to God, and then that's it. We never hear from anymore, except for allusions to them in other parts of the Bible. Using Cain as an example of a wicked person. I think he appears probably half a dozen times that way in the rest of the Bible. And Abel appears in the rest of the Bible too, probably in about, I don't know, almost the same amount. That's curious. You have just a little story about them, and then it reverberates for thousands of years into other parts of the Bible and history, obviously. So it would be good to know, what's the deal with these guys? What's going on underneath the story, so to speak, so that we get a firmer grasp of why they're so important. The first thing I think we should know is in chapter 4 of Genesis, it says Cain was the firstborn, and Eve says, I have gotten a man for the Lord. Now, that's an interesting little statement. I have gotten a man for the Lord, because it means more than what you're just reading there. You could read that 1,000 times and say, okay, so he's, for the Lord. Eve says he's for the Lord. But actually what it means is that he's the firstborn, you see. And you know all about how the firstborns were, right from the beginning, they were designated with a greater portion of the inheritance. And, we know the story of Jacob and Esau, for example. Esau's the firstborn, but he turns out to be wicked just like Cain does, okay? And then he sells his birthright for a mess of pottage, as the Bible says, to Jacob. And then we have the whole thing in Romans 9 about, before they were born, God elected Jacob over Esau. So you see how prominent they become. And then there's other firstborn and secondborns stories in the Old Testament. Yeah, most of them go the same way, where the firstborn turns out to be a dud and the secondborn takes over all that the firstborn should have done. And we have that kind of case here. Um, you know how Rebecca and was it Rebecca and Isaac, of course, had Jacob and Esau, and Rebecca is helping Jacob to to deceive. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, Rebecca is helping Jacob to deceive Isaac, so that Isaac gives the blessing to Esau. I mean, to Jacob instead of Esau. I'll get my mouth straight soon enough. Hold on. So that's a very fascinating story, because here we have a divided family, obviously. And Rebecca favors Jacob, which shouldn't be done in any household. The minute you have the mother favoring one child over the other, it just spells disaster. Disaster. And this is true in our day as well. I've seen this over and over again. The mother, he's the cutest, or he's the most talented, or she's the most talented, and and most articulate, and it's hard not to shift your affections to that child, because you always want your children to be something great, and this one has great potential, and so we'll shower him with a little bit more blessing, but we'll make it subtle so nobody notices. Well, the kids notice right away when that's happening, and they resent it. I remember the story with Joseph and his brothers. Okay, well, here you have another one. Joseph was born, he was the next to the last in the family, and but Jacob favored him over all the other sons. And what was the son's reaction? It's like, well, who are you? Your feet don't stink. Come on. So they ended up burying him in a hole, and some travelers came by and saw him in the hole, took him out and took him to Egypt, and that whole thing. So God used Jacob after that to humble his brothers, basically, because they had to come to Egypt for food, because the land of Israel was not producing any food. So again, so you see that whole thing. And this is what happened with Eve and Cain and Abel. Okay, now Abel wasn't born yet, of course, but Eve's had her sights set on Cain. She was going to make him a great man. That's why she says here, I got a man for the Lord. So she was going to invest everything she could to maybe make up for her sin of plunging the whole human race into original sin. She's going to make up for it by giving Cain to the Lord, and making a special offering, a sacrifice, so to speak. Somewhat like Hannah did with Samuel. She sacrificed everything because she was barren, and God blessed her with a child, and she was overjoyed. And she spent the rest of her life just doing whatever she could for Samuel to make him the great prophet that he became to be. And that's what Eve was going to do for Cain. Okay. And then Abel comes along. Okay. And, maybe he's not as big. He's sort of slow of speech. He, just didn't have it all together, so to speak. And, this happens in families. Sometimes first child is like Superman, and the second child is, half half of that. And sometimes it's the other way around. You never know what you're going to get. I can tell you that because I have 11 of them. So, and some you think are going to be the most promising turn out to be, not so promising. And then just the opposite. Some you think, they're, what do they call them? Wallflowers? Not wallflowers. What is that expression? Slow bloomers. Okay. You want your child to be what you want it to be when you want it to be it. Okay. And sometimes it just doesn't happen, no matter how much work you put into it, because their brains just aren't ready for it. We all develop at a different rate, and some people don't develop until they're 25 years old. Okay. And we've seen people, children growing up, and they're beaten and battered, and most of the time, that's what results. Someone who's beaten and battered, they never get out of it. And sometimes you can have that, and this person will rise out of it and become a famous person because they use whatever they have found along the way in their suffering, and they become great people. We've seen that over and over again. Okay. So, this is what I'm gleaning out of the Cain and Abel story, is that there's more to this than meets the eye. Okay. So it's like Eve and Cain against Abel, because when Abel's born, it doesn't say, I have gotten a man for the Lord. Only Cain. So, that's what's going on, I think. So, so Abel was born when Adam is 130 years old. And so I think we can gather from that these men are, they're past 100 when this altercation takes place. And what does that tell you? Well, if from the time that Cain was born and Eve says, I've gotten a man for the Lord, until 130 years plus after, that means this favoritism toward Cain is happening for a very long time. And he thinks he is just hot stuff compared to his brother Abel. He's the firstborn. His mom favors him. We hear nothing about Eve and Abel having a relationship, nothing. Okay, so it's all Cain. So he, once you're favored like that, and you think you're the, chief cheese of the whole thing here, because Seth is not yet born. He's not born until after Abel dies. So we just have two kids. And they're growing up, and it's 130, say 40, 50, 60 years. So we're talking about what? When Abel becomes a man, let's say at 30, that's 30 years. That's when Cain is 160. Okay, so Cain not only has the privilege of having his mother shower him with gifts and favoritism, he's older than his brother, a lot older. Okay, so again, it's building the case where Cain thinks he's just the ruler. He is it, and Eve is reinforcing all that. So Eve is actually making things worse here. Not only is she not making up for the big sin she committed in the Garden of Eden, she's now making these two children of hers at odds with one another, because Cain thinks he's just, so good, and anything he does has to be accepted, and he just rules, and there's just, he answers to no one. So Abel comes along, this probably feeble child, just not as, big and handsome and old as his brother Cain, and offers the sacrifice, and God accepts it right off the bat. It's just like, Abel was probably very humble, and Cain was very proud, and thought that, hey, I'll just give God the scraps of my garden here, my tremendous garden that I made with my own hands. And that's the thing that God hates the most in mankind. Because look, everything's given to us from the beginning. So as Paul says in 1 Corinthians 4:7, says to the Corinthians, everything's been given to you. What do you have to boast about? That's it. So don't get proud. Because that's the thing that God hates the most, is the proud man who thinks that everything he has come to him by his own doing. You see? And that's what Cain was. So he could offer God just the, minuscule of his garden, and, hey, I'm Cain, man. You got to accept it. Okay? I'm the ruler around here. And this little runt of Abel, okay, so you can see what has happened. I mean, Cain is so proud that he is who he is, that this little runt comes along and God accepts his sacrifice. And Cain was made for this. Remember, it says, I have begotten a man for the Lord, Eve said. So if anybody was deserving of this, Cain thought he was. And here, God doesn't even accept his sacrifice. And he accepts Abel's sacrifice. So Cain's got a lot to deal with, man. This guy is just over the top with self-affection, and maybe he thought that God should give him some gifts. That's how great he thought he was. And so this little runt of a brother comes up and offers it, and God accepts it. So that hit Cain's button. It's all that had to happen. And the rage in him, and that comes from thinking you're greater than you really are. That's why you would have rage, because you've been this way for years. How many years? If he's 160 and Cain is 30, whoa. I mean, so for at least 30 years he felt this way, because Abel's 30 when all this happens. And so that's a long time to hold some pride and grudge against your little brother. So then you have this, kills his brother, of course, in cold blood. And, God calls to him, and all that kind of, all that stuff goes on. And now Cain, being as selfish as he is, concerned, he's the first narcissist we've ever had. And maybe Eve was, but Cain is definitely a narcissist, and he thinks the whole world revolves around him. So what's his first thought going to be? His first thought's going to be, this punishment's too great for me, because God banned him, to another land to live by himself and live off the land. Nobody's going to help him. Nobody's going to be with him. And by the way, it says, the people are not going to be able to touch him. And so how many people are we talking about? By this time, we're down the road we don't know when Adam and Eve had Cain, okay? But let's say they had him, like, I don't know, 25 years down the pike. I don't know. I mean, the Bible doesn't give us that information. But, first Adam and Eve have to get themselves together, because they just plunged the whole world into death and sin. and they're reaping the fruits of that. And so they got to get themselves together, and then to have a child, at least to have the semblance of a good family, you're going to have some, you know, let's say remedial help. Um, so, but we're talking probably 200 years down the road, and you've got all these people. Okay, so that means that Adam and Eve have been busy producing children, and then their children producing children within this 200-year period. And you can imagine there could be thousands of people by this time, at least hundreds. So they're the people, and Cain knows all these people. He still thinks he's the chief cheese of them all because he's the oldest. And but when they find out he's killed Abel, they're all going to come after him. Of course they are. And so he's worried about that because he still thinks he's the chief cheese. And Lord, you can't let these people kill me. I'm special. So God puts a mark on Cain, and the Lord listens to his plea, I guess, because I forget what I wrote in my commentary about that. I should probably look that up before I answer this question. So let me do that. Let me continue this story. So I just plumb forgot what I wrote about that. But it's in my Genesis commentary in case anybody wants to go look at it. And so we'll continue this story next time. But thanks for bringing it up because this is a very important story in the Bible. It sets the tone for what sin is going to do to the human race. I don't know if you've had turmoil in your family, okay? But sometimes this is like the prime place where it starts, the family. Why? Because you're so close together. You live together. Everybody knows who you are. You're not going to get away with anything. They know your good points. They know your bad points. And sometimes you get good points and good points, working together and make something great. But sometimes you get bad points and bad points that turn out to be not so great for the family, and they can rip them apart. That's why we have almost 60% of marriages that end up in a divorce in the United States, and second marriages aren't any better. It's around 60% also. Okay. And then the children are involved getting, they experience the fruits of divorce, and they're not pretty. There's going to be division everywhere. So we're just following exactly what happened with Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel. And it's especially deleterious when you have the mother showing favoritism, and mothers tend to do this. Okay. Fathers are a little bit more even-handed about it, but they can still fall into the same, favoritism. Like I want my son to be a big football player, and he'll do anything to pave the path for him to do that. And that means showing favoritism. Okay. So, this is just a story, happened thousands of years ago, but still happens today. And that's all because of sin. Okay. So anyway, we'll get to the rest of this next week. So I already spent 25 minutes on it. Okay, so here's another one. Dear Dr. Sungenis, I hope this message finds you well. It's been a long time. I've been following your work, and I appreciate the effort you put into spreading the gospel teachings and helping us better understand our faith, the science, and the world around us. Whenever I can, I tune into your weekly stream lives and watch your other videos. During your live sessions, or if you have some time online, I would greatly appreciate your insights on the following questions. Have you read or are you aware of the book by Dr. Doug Corrigan titled The Author of Light? If so, would you recommend it? I'm sure he has some good things in there, but what I do know he has is, this praise of the special theory of relativity. I'm sorry, I can't go there. Okay, so, and that's apparently the backbone of the book, special relativity. So, whatever he's going to get out of that, it's built on a false foundation. Okay, because special relativity is false. As you know the story, and I've probably said it 1,000 times on this program, special relativity was Einstein's way to deal with the 1887 Michelson-Morley experiment, which showed that the Earth was not moving in space. The most famous experiment ever done in modern history was the Michelson-Morley experiment. Because if they couldn't find at least some answer to it, then they'd all be kissing the feet of the Pope, who was the one who told Galileo, your whole system's wrong. The church was right. Okay? And because Galileo believed the earth went around the sun. So for 25 years, they're scratching their head trying to figure out how they're going to answer this, because nobody wants to kiss the feet of the Pope, especially Albert Einstein, who hated the Catholic Church. His wife was divorced by him because she became Catholic. And at least that's one of the reasons. The other reason was he was a serial adulterer. Okay, so not too good for a family. Yeah. And his kids, he hardly paid attention to them and left one in a sanitarium. And just, that's a crazy house, so to speak. And never went to visit him. Wanted to pawn him off to the government so they would pay for his care. And Edward, I think his name was. So you're not talking about a very nice guy, okay? But his main motive would be, to not allow the Catholic Church to get a foothold over influencing mankind. And the way you do that is you find some way, somehow, to show that the earth is still moving. Because that would make the Catholic Church the laughingstock of the world. Here's a church that says not only is this a matter of faith, and why is it a matter of faith? Well, not because it's, dealing with the faith, so to speak, but it's dealing with the veracity and accuracy of the Bible, which is our faith. I mean, we get everything from the Bible, okay? And we even get the fact that we have a magisterium and tradition from the Bible, okay? So if you're saying that the Bible made a mistake, you're implying that there's other mistakes the Bible has made. The whole thing could be a mistake for all we know, if you find just one mistake. And that's what Bellarmine said to Galileo. He said, look, if you say the Bible is wrong in saying that Jacob had 12 sons, and you claim he had 13, well, you're a heretic, because you just denounced the accuracy of the Bible. And it doesn't matter what passage you're talking about in the Bible. It could be, genealogical or chronological or a science issue. Not that the Bible is a science textbook, no. But when it touches upon science, whatever it says is true. That much we can depend upon. And that's basically what Bellarmine told Galileo. Okay, so if you're going to say the earth goes around the sun and the Bible says the sun goes around the earth, you're a heretic. Okay, so I mean, it's as simple as that. So the only way Einstein could answer this is by basically turning physics upside down on its head. And the first thing would be if you make the speed of light constant, then the earth has to move. If you make the earth constant, that is not moving, then the speed of light is not constant. It's one or the other. So which one did Einstein choose? Well, he ain't going to choose the earth being constant. he's going to choose light, and that's called a postulate. He couldn't prove it. He just says this has to be the postulate. If you want the Earth to move around the sun, here's your only choice. Now, this is after 25 years of banging their head against the wall, trying to answer this experiment, and nobody could. And this guy comes along and says, here, it may not work, but I'm telling you, the only way it's going to happen is if you make the speed of light constant. And the way you do that is you take away the ether that everybody thought, Maxwell, Hertz, everybody was working. It was the best answer to electromagnetic theory and everything else that science had come up with in the late 1800s, was that it was going through ether. Even Maxwell's famous equation that they still use today, it was based on electromagnetic waves going through ether. Okay, so now he had a constant speed for light there, c, but with the condition that light can only go the same speed if the ether doesn't move. Okay, if the ether moves, then the light speed is going to be greater, or it could be less, depending on which direction the light's going, you see. So Einstein figured out, well, let's get rid of the ether, and that way there won't be any difference in the speed of light, no matter which direction it goes. And if that's the case, we could say that results in the Earth having to move, because that would be the only other thing that was left, you see. So the world loved him for that. Loved him. And he became world famous. And there's a lot of other things to it, but so if your whole book is based on the theory of special relativity, then you have just fallen into the rabbit hole of having to swallow everything else that modern science is going to say about itself. Okay, and I'm sure that's what he does in the rest of the book. I haven't read it yet, but I know from just reading the reviews of it, this is how it starts out, with a special theory of relativity. So in that sense, I can't recommend it to you. The only way I could recommend it to you is to read it and find out where all the mistakes are. Okay, because that's what you're going to have to do. Because if he accepts special relativity, then he's going to make other mistakes. Okay, which I've seen over and over and over again. So for that reason, no. Now, you ask also, similarly, I was wondering if you could share your thoughts on the newly released Ignatius Press, Ignatius Catholic Study Bible, Old and New Testament, Second Catholic Edition, which comes with over 2,300 pages of text, extensive comments, okay, and so on. Well, I'm sure it has its good parts, okay. I mean, let's see, there's a tendency today toward liberal theology. And if you know anything about liberal theology, you know that it's not the same as what Catholics were taught prior to the modern age. I mean, you have some people that go as far as questioning the virgin birth, questioning the perpetual virginity of Mary, questioning the resurrection of Christ, questioning the inspiration and inerrancy of Scripture, questioning the papal infallibility, questioning whether women can be, or actually approving of the fact that women can be priests or deacons. It just all down the line. Almost every traditional doctrine that we have believed has been attacked by the liberals, the modernists, and most of them now are Catholic, and they make up most of the Catholic Church today, at least the upper echelon of educated Catholics, let's say, 90%, I would say, okay? And that includes cardinals, bishops, and priests, okay? So, and that's, a lot of that's due to historical criticism, and I don't want to get into that right now, but so I question how fastidious the Ignatius Bible has been toward holding the line against these modern liberal influences. And now you're going to make me buy it and pick up a copy and find out if they have been. So much to read, so much to do. Oh my gosh. But yeah, I almost have to do that. So I'm going to order that. I'm going to look at it and tell you. So next week I'll have the verdict for you. Right now I can tell you this, that one of the major tendencies in the modernist understanding of Scripture and how it's all going to fold out is this concentration on the Jews. And I bet you my bottom dollar that the Ignatius Bible, at least the 2,300 pages of commentary, are going to be saying something about that. I don't think they would leave it out at this point, considering all the controversy that's been happening as a result of it. Like I said, even last week, I said that the 2006 adult catechism written by the USCCB said that the Mosaic covenant is eternally valid for the Jews. That means it's never been revoked, never will be revoked. And the Jews somehow are still the people of God and still have promises coming to them because God made them. And whether that's spiritual or physical really makes no difference. It's just, there's hardly anything different from the Old Testament now in the minds of these liberal modernist Catholic scholars. And you see it all over the place now. Okay. So my question is whether the Ignatius Bible is going to hold the line against that stuff. My guess is no. Okay. No. So because Ignatius Press has continually gone down the road of liberalism for the last 10, 20, 30 years. And it gets worse every year. So, yeah, that would be my first impression. Now, I may change that totally once I read the book, but I doubt that's going to be the case. I just doubt. I've been through this too many times. Okay. So, but thank you for the alert. I will definitely take a look at that. Okay. There's a question here about the from James about the Orthodox splitting in 1054. And that's important today because there's a lot of people who are so disgusted with Pope Francis that they're making the exit to the Orthodox Church. And I can see why, but that's not the way to go. Okay, it's not the way to go. If there's any trouble in the church, which there is, we need to stay in the church and fight them in the church. And this has been true ever since the church started. There's people who are going to come in and cause other people to go into heresy and schism and you name it. And the first tendency of the mind is, let's get comfortable. Let's go somewhere where we don't have these problems. And that's your first mistake. Okay. Because you've lost. If you end up leaving the institution, the organization, which is just as important as the doctrine, because you really can't have doctrine unless you have an organization to make the doctrine. So it's like a two-sided coin. They're all two-sided, of course, but you can't separate them. You cannot separate the organization from the doctrine any more than you can, efface the front of a quarter and keep the back and think that you have a real quarter. You can't. Okay. They're both connected. And that's what makes the Catholic Church distinctive among all the other denominations or, Orthodox or whoever. The organization persists. And you have to stay in it and fight within it, not go outside of it. So because this whole thing is not to make you comfortable. It's to keep the church on the straight and narrow with the help of Jesus Christ, of course. That's the goal. And if it hurts, it hurts. Tough. Okay? We're only in this world for a short time. So however much it hurts, sustain it. Suffer with it. Because it's all going to be gone in a short amount of time. And then we'll live forever in eternity. That's the scale upon which everything you do has to be weighed. Okay. All right. So I'm going to lay that aside for now because I just don't want to get into it at this point. Let me see what to do here. Oh, I did deal with that. So I'm going to hold off on that one. Did I explain this one? Yeah. Okay. All right. So I'll be able to go to the chat room now. It only took 45 minutes. And let's see what's on your mind today. All right. Okay, so let's see what we have here. What do you think about the stories where people say they died, went to heaven, met Jesus, then returned, or incredibly had even been to hell for 30 minutes? Are they lying? Well, a lie would, the first connotation we have of a lie is somebody who tells a story that they know is not true deliberately. Okay. You can lie, but not even know you're lying. That's the distinction we have to make, first of all. Okay. And when you're talking about somebody who is now in a unconscious state and their subconscious is taking over, okay. I mean, do you know how powerful your subconscious is? And one way to determine that is by looking at the dreams you have every night. I had a doozy last night. Sometimes my dreams are so weird and frightening. Is that I just wake up and don't want to go to sleep right away because I'll be dreaming the same dream. I have to wait at least 15, 20 minutes to go back to sleep. And so my dream doesn't come back to haunt me. Once a week, at least that happens to me. So, but it's powerful. It's like I said to myself when I woke up, I said, it was like I was really there. It's like real. It was like daytime. That's how powerful your subconscious can be. And in that sense, your mind is always working. It just never stops thinking of things, day or night. So, and it gets a lot more, I don't know what you would say, a lot more acute and interesting and probably important too when you're on your deathbed. You are taking drugs definitely because you're anesthetized and you're just not in a normal state of mind. Being on a hospital bed about to die, and they say when you're about to die, and when you're fighting on the battlefield, so to speak, they say if you're about to die, you've been shot, or you're falling off a cliff or whatever, your whole life goes before you. Okay. Well, how does that happen so fast? But it happens. Okay. So you see how powerful your mind is, that when it's under pressure, it can start thinking of things that it doesn't normally think about, especially when death is in your face. So that means what? Your mind is a very tricky thing. And you know how delicate it is, because if you drink alcohol, or you take drugs, marijuana or LSD or whatever, the cocaine, heroin, what does it do? It affects how your mind thinks. It affects how your mind reacts to everything. So the mind is very sensitive. And if it's a little off kilter, it's because something in the environment has made an impression on it, that it starts thinking thoughts that may be not true, but look true, like your dreams are. Okay. So I even have dreams where you wake up and you analyze it and you go, I know that I dreamed that a long time ago. So the dream is still in your memory of your subconscious. And anyway, what am I trying to say? Let me tell you in a second here. I'm trying to say that the deathbed, when they think you've died, your heart stopped or something, all kinds of things can be affecting your brain, your mind. Okay. And naturally, nobody wants to go to hell, do they? So the most comforting thought you can have is, and your brain works this way without you even knowing it. Okay. This is the way psychology works. They figure out what the problem is, and then they know how your brain is going to react to it. Like some people who've been in a horrible car accident, and then they can't remember what happened like weeks later. It's just a blank to them. And they've been through a horrendous experience that if you're going to remember anything, it's going to be that. But they can't remember anything. So why is that happening? Because the mind works to protect you, and protects you by blocking out that memory. That's how intricate God has made our mind, because it knows that if you started thinking about it, you may not be able to cope with it and go crazy or commit suicide or something like that would happen. So your mind has a mechanism where it blocks it, at least for a period of time, until you can cope with it, which may be years down the road. Okay. So when you're about to die on the hospital bed, and yet you're not going to die, how is your mind going to help you feel more comfortable with this, or to cope with it? Because you're leaving the world. You've been here all your life. It's all you know, except for your faith, of course. But it's all you know, and you're suddenly going to leave it. Well, how does your mind cope with it? It creates images, just like when you dream. It creates images to comfort you. Okay? And if it's wrong, and you do actually go to hell, well, your mind can't do anything about that one. Okay? But it's going to create dreams that are just as real as living life sometimes. And that's what's happening to these people. Nobody's going to heaven. Nobody's going to hell until you're actually clinically dead. And they even have a problem with that today. They don't even know what clinically dead means anymore. Okay, there's all kinds of theories out there, and they're all contradicting one another. But after a time, if you don't not breathing and walking anymore, everybody figures, okay, you're dead. But there have been people who have been buried or have been on the way to the cemetery and suddenly woke up. Okay, so that's what I mean. But they were diagnosed as being clinically dead. So they're alive, and what's the mind going to do? Because you are constantly, whether you're in a subconscious state of dreaming or you're anesthetized, your mind is always thinking. Those poor people under anesthetization, they might not feel physical pain, but who knows what they're going through in their minds when when you normally feel pain when the knife's going in there to cut your skin off or whatever in an operation. We wonder if they're, they don't remember the pain when they come out of the anesthetization, but who knows what's going on in there when they're being operated on. Okay. Like nobody knows what you're dreaming when they see you dreaming. So anyway, that's my explanation for it. Okay. And I've read the book. What was that? The little kid, what was he, like 10 years old? He died. They made a movie of it. I forget what it was called. So I saw the movie. I read the book. And because I wanted to get down to the bottom of this was a few years ago, maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago. Something about heaven. The kid claimed to go to heaven, see the grandfather. The grandfather said something that the kid remembered that happened on Earth. And so they were trying to make it, when they made the movie, they were trying to make it so that the kid really did go to heaven. And he could prove it by certain things that were said or that he did. They remembered when he was in heaven that, you have to read it to get the gist of it. But I went through the book. That's where I saw what was happening. Because I saw the book contradict itself in about, I don't know, half a dozen different places where this kid's remembrance and reality conflicted, and they just glossed over it like it was no big deal. But I, going into it to find out if they were really telling the truth, found out at the end of the book, no. Now I'm not saying that it did it deliberately, okay? Because as I said, there's a difference between lying deliberately and lying because you really don't know the truth and you think you're telling the truth. I meet a lot of people like that all the time. And it happens to be in religion. We all think we have the truth and we go out there and preach it. And we find out later that we've been telling a lie. Okay. Like say all the Protestants that are out there, preaching their version of the gospel and they suddenly become Catholic. Well, that means that every time they preach the gospel as Protestant, they were telling a lie, but not deliberately. They thought it was the truth. So that happens a lot in life. Okay. So they may not have been, have ulterior motives, like to make a lot of money, for example, which I'm sure the movie did and the book did. Again, I still can't remember the title, something about heaven. But, as innocent as it may be, the fact is we want to know whether it's the truth or not. The truth is no, nobody goes to heaven before they are clinically dead. And once their soul is in heaven, it ain't coming back. Okay. And so are the case with those who go to hell or those who go to purgatory. They're not coming back. They're not going to communicate with you. They're gone into another world. So don't let anybody fool you thinking that, oh, wow, I see the white lights and all this stuff. Again, that's what their brain does to make them feel comfortable in this horrendous situation of dying if they're going to die. Okay. All right, let's move on. Dr. Sungenis, what is your assessment of your debate with Dr. Fuzz? Dr. Fuzz. I've never seen a nickname like that before. Fuzz. I would definitely pick another one. I forget what his real name is. It's close to Fuzz, but it's not exactly Fuzz. So he could have picked something else. But anyway, um, um, that debate was an interesting debate. I had to be honest, I thought I was going to have more of a challenge from Dr. Rana than I did. Uh, and I was well prepared for that debate. Um, but see, um, I think the thing that sticks out the most for me was anybody who is going to try to impose the Big Bang Theory on the chapter 1 of Genesis. I just have a certain loathing of people who do that. If you want to believe in the Big Bang Theory or evolution or long ages or what, you can go ahead and take that risk, but don't try to impose it on the Bible as if you can give sanction to what theories there are out there by now having the Bible back it up. To me, that crosses the line. Science and religion are always going to have their problems. But if you're going to claim to meld them together, buddy, your exegesis must be flawless. Absolutely flawless, because the burden is on you. And if you're going to mix and match these things, you better be on target. And the more I talked to him in that debate, the more I found out that he not only wasn't on target, he didn't even know what he was talking about at times. And I just got really disgusted, because here's a guy who claims to be a preacher of the truth and can't articulate what his view is really, except for what he's already memorized. Because I know that guys come into a debate having memorized things and just spurt it out as their position. And that's why one of the most important parts of a debate is the cross-examination. It's like you're in a court of law and your defendant gets up there and says his spiel about why he didn't kill John Jones. And then the prosecutor gets his turn to really examine whether you're telling the truth or not. And if they're good at what they do, they can make you look like a fool, like you are really deliberately lying by just looking at a few facts and turning them upside down and sideways and all. And I could tell that Dr. Rana didn't do any of that. He was taking what he was told by Hugh Ross, who's another guy who tries to do the same thing. He'll give you this big sob story about how he grew up and, he knew that there couldn't be any contradiction between science and the Bible, and yet he believes in the Big Bang Theory and then tries to impose that on the Bible. That's where Rana's getting it from. And Hugh Ross, to me, is just another, he may be sincere, but he's sincerely wrong, okay? Because if you're going to impose Big Bang Theory on Genesis, you are going to have one difficult time. And that's why I kept bringing up this idea of, I asked Dr. Rana if he believed that, do you believe like Hugh Ross that the reason there was no light on the first days because some planet like the size of Mars bombarded into the Earth and caused a big cloud of dust or whatever to remain around for millions of years? And he apparently did, because he didn't deny it. But this is the kind of stuff that Hugh Ross comes up with. First of all, where do you get off on saying that a big planet the size of Mars crashed into the Earth? Wouldn't that basically destroy anything that was created on Earth? Yeah, it would, if not already splitting it apart in two. Oh, they didn't talk about that stuff. They just had to figure out how, if the sun is made on the first day, nobody can see it. Well, the only way that's going to happen is you have some cloud there, because if it exists, it has to be obscured. But nobody thinks, well, wait a minute. How can we say a planet bumped into the Earth and caused this explosion that made all this dust if we don't have any evidence for it? Yeah, well, we got to make it fit. Okay, so it's like one thing. I mean, basically, they're telling us whatever you read in Genesis 1 didn't really happen as it's stated. And then they talk about, they take pride in going over these Hebrew verbs. Haya in Hebrew, it means in English, let it be. So they're trying to make a distinction between God created and God saying, let it be. So that let it be doesn't mean that God created something, which is a total farce. I don't know where Hugh Ross learned his Hebrew, but that ain't the case for the Hebrew Haya. And it's used 7 times in Genesis where God said, let be the firmament, let be this, let be that, and they suddenly exist, which is the point I was trying to make in Genesis 1. I says, if your definition of Haya is true, then it should just say, and God said, let there be light, period. But the sentence finishes with, and there was light. Okay, so what would be the logical reason to make light and yet not let the light shine on the earth and have this big cloud supposedly for millions of years, because this cloud is supposed to last for at least 3 days, and 3 days in Dr. Rana's time and Hugh Ross's time is millions of years. And then suddenly, and they don't give any explanation to how this cloud suddenly went away on the 4th day. And so we have light on the 4th day, sun, moon, and stars. Okay. And then the other problem is, of course, if you say the days are millions of years, doesn't it seem a little bit odd to you that the plants are made and then and that's on the 3rd day? So I don't know how many millions of years that is from your Big Bang explosion, but let's say it's I don't know. The Earth doesn't come until 8.5 billion years later. So let's say that the plants are made in the 9 millionth year, because the 4th day, again, is millions of years. Okay. So how are the plants surviving this without having sufficient light or any light at all for millions of years, and then the sun and the stars finally appear? I mean, it just doesn't make sense. This is what happens when you try to impose Big Bang Theory on Genesis. Okay? You just can't do it. God wrote Genesis 1 in such a way where it precludes any other kind of system being imposed on Genesis 1. Okay? And yet they're going to try to do it whatever way and make a ministry of it. And they're just flat out wrong. And then, I could go on and on with this stuff, but I don't know. It's like the basic thing is whatever way Genesis is presenting himself, you can't read it that way. Let me give you the secret of how to read it, is basically what's happening here. And once you start doing that, brother, you're off in no man's land. Okay? And that's where they are. And if any of them, Hugh Ross, Fuzz Rana, anybody from that organization, Reasons to Believe, wants to debate me again, I will be first in line to get there. Believe me. Okay? Because I hate this stuff. I hate when people do this kind of stuff. They just make It's just a tragedy what they do with the Bible to try to make it coincide with the Big Bang. And then, of course, the Big Bang itself, as I said at the end of the debate, it's not science. Okay? This is patchwork ideology is what it is. Because they started with the Big Bang. They think they had their solution because all they had before was a steady state theory. That all that we see out there, since we can't explain how it got here, it must be eternal. So it's been steady the whole time, you say. Hasn't changed. And that's all they had before. Okay? So now that means you got to stretch your mind to go to infinity. Well, what's that? So when somebody came along, Edwin Hubble, and we know why he did this, by the way. Yeah, to keep the Earth out of the center, he created the Big Bang Theory. Okay? Instead of having a Euclidean three-dimensional universe, he created a Riemannian two-dimensional universe so he could put the galaxies on the surface of this balloon, blow it up so that they separated from each other, and voila, we have answer to the redshift. Why? Because we don't want to kiss the feet of the Pope. See, we're finding evidence out there that the Earth is in the center called galaxy redshift, but we can't go by that. Because that means that Galileo was wrong. You see how important this issue is? I mean, it's just... So, but okay, so great idea. We have a beginning. So everybody gets, giddy because we finally have a cosmological theory that has a beginning, just like Genesis does. But that's where the comparison stops. So you have a beginning. Big deal. Do you suddenly have the right now to impose yourself on Scripture because you have a beginning? Well, look, you only got two choices. You either have infinity or you have a beginning. So you're just taking the other choice. That's it. But can you support that? Is it any better than your infinity model? Well, no. Why? First of all, that's not what Genesis says. Okay? Genesis says the earth came first and the stars came afterward. The Big Bang says the stars came first and then the earth came 8.5 billion years later. So you can't, okay? I mean, there's your first clue. You're not going to succeed. And you really don't have to go any further. But the Big Bang itself is a farce. They had problems with the Big Bang right from the get-go. Until one day in 1980, Alan Guth said, okay, well, the only way we can supercharge this thing to get it where we think it's got to be and give enough time for evolution is have a super speed inflation period to set the mold so that the mold can then grow out of itself and, give us the universe that we need. But they can't prove that there was an inflation period, much less than they can prove there was a Big Bang in the first place. This is all made up in their mind. Okay? Now, science, real science, goes by empirical evidence. Okay? And that's why they're having such a problem with the James Webb Telescope now. Because what do we see? We see empirical evidence of fully mature galaxies at the edge of the universe, something the Big Bang Theory did not predict. Okay? They predicted globs of stars, but not fully formed galaxies. So it doesn't deal with empirical evidence, and that's why it has a problem with the so-called speed that it has to be expanding today. They can't find the energy for it. If they added up all the energy that was in the universe to make this Big Bang explosion have the accelerated expansion it's supposed to have today, they have 4.5% of the energy in the whole universe. And even then, they can't use 4.5% because that's dedicated to other systems. But that's all the energy they have. And so where do you get the energy to have this expansion? See, we don't have that problem as geocentrists. Why? Because our universe ain't expanding. It's rotating. And there's no problem with that because why? Once you push an object and goes in circular motion, it's going to keep in that circular motion ad infinitum. It's called the conservation of angular momentum. Okay? So we don't have a problem with trying to find out where's the energy to make the universe rotate. We don't need it. Okay? So it's because it's a closed system. You have an expanding universe. You have an open system now. So you better have the energy. But they can't find it. So what do? Well, we just make it up. You just make it up and give it some fancy name, and they'll all fall for it. Because the scientists want to preserve their jobs and their prestige and the money they make. And the people think that the guys who walk around in white lab coats and give us these fancy equations, well, gee, they're next to God. They must be honest. They can't lie to us. Yeah. Okay, so what do? They make it up. It's like, we have dark energy. 75% of the energy that's needed for the Big Bang is coming from dark energy. Oh, okay, so where is it? Can you show me in the laboratory? Give me an experiment. Show me where you found it. Well, we can't do that. We haven't gotten that far yet, but this is the only way it's going to work. Oh, obviously it's the only way it's going to work. Okay, so that's not empirical science. Empirical science is when you discover whatever energy is that's out there, and then you can, oh, yeah, I see how it works now. That energy can be used to accelerate the universe. They don't do that in science anymore. That's why it's not science. It's make it up as you go along to preserve the paradigm that we've already begun with. Because if we have to go to the people and say, oh, we're wrong again, they're going to lose faith in us. They're going to stop supporting us, and we're going to stop getting grants from the government, and we're going to stop controlling society because, which almost happened with COVID, as you know. Okay. But if they have to make a big dump with the Big Bang Theory, it ain't going to be the same for them anymore. Okay. And I think that day is coming. The day is coming. It's inevitable. Now, it may be 50 years, 100 years, 200, I don't know, but it's coming. Because a system like this cannot hold itself together. All right. So, yeah. So not only is Fuz Rana's exegesis of Genesis absurd, he's believing in an absurd theory to try to impose into Genesis, which is the Big Bang Theory. Okay, so much for that. Somebody's trying to reach me. All right. Patrick James says, if free will originates from God and if free will is inclusive of possibility of evil, and the creatures of God did evil due to this free will, then does not that not make God the actual source of evil? No, it does not. God certainly knows about evil, okay? But when you're talking about God as the source of evil, that means it's the source of somebody else committing evil. And you can't make that connection. Just because God knows it, what evil is, doesn't mean that you can now make a connection that it is inevitable that his creature is going to do evil. Okay, can't do that. What you have to do here in this case is you have to ask yourself the question. This is the $64,000 question. Do you believe God is omnipotent enough to know the past to the future, even his own, and yet still give man a free will that is uncoerced, uninfluenced, by God or anything close to God, so that the man can make his own decision without any divine thing impinging on him, except the ability to make a decision. Do you believe that's possible? Okay. You're going to have to answer that question. And of course, there's only two answers to it, two possible answers. One is no, I don't believe that it's possible for God to know something's going to happen in the future and yet have no coercion, influence, or whatever on his free will creature to make a decision. Okay? Because many people will do this. They will say, well, how can God know the future and still give man a free will? I mean, isn't it already written in stone that the man's going to commit the sin? And so how can he have free will? Okay, so that's the question they have, and they don't answer that question, of course, because they can't, because the very reason for the question is so that they can give a rationale for why they're not going to believe in man having a free will, because they reasoned out in their own mind that it's not possible for God to know the future and give man a free will. So that's why this question is all important. Do you think it's possible for God to know the future and still give man a free will? So if you say no, well, of course, you're going to have the difficulty that's coming out of this question. So what's the answer have to be? It has to be yes. Because God is so omnipotent, okay, he has the ability, believe it or not, to know the future and still give man a free will. If you can't accept that, then there's nothing else that can be done for you. Okay? So even with God himself, because God has a free will, the church alarms us to this 4 times in different sections of history. This question has been raised. And that is, was God forced to create the world? And if the answer is yes, then God is a determined being. And that means that something else is behind God or within God who controls his actions, because it's all determined. And God can't change his mind. He can't get out of it, so to speak. Okay? Now, the church says, no, we cannot have that conception of God where he's a determined being. Because a determined being is determined by someone. And that means that it's all cut in stone and that's it. No questions asked. The church says, no, God is not that way. God is free. He has a free will to do anything that is good in any way he wants to do it. He's only limited in the sense that he can only create good. And that only makes sense because the scripture says God cannot lie. A lie is evil. God cannot lie. That means he's limited. And when you compare that to the devil, well, the devil, he can use good, he can use evil, he can use anywhere in between to do his bidding, but not God. God can only do what's good. Okay? So the question would come, well, is it good to create? I mean, it must have been good not to create because that's the state that God was in prior. He hadn't created yet. Even if we can legitimately use the word yet for someone who's eternal. How do we understand that? Well, we just have to take it a piece at a time here. But, the time before God created, if we can use that word, must have been good because God's not going to live in bad, right? So that leaves the question whether the creation itself is good. And of course it's good because God made it and you can't do evil. That's why the days of creation said at the end, and there was evening and morning one day, and it was very good. And then the sixth day says, and it was very good, you see. So, but the point of this whole inquiry here is whether God was forced to create. The answer is no. And the church has been very clear about that. So if he's not forced to create, then he could have not created. He could have decided, well, yeah, I know it's good that we create, and it's also good that I don't create. So which one did he choose? Obviously, he chose the one to create, because we wouldn't be here talking about it. All right. But God still made a decision. And that requires free will. It wasn't determined. Although we're not done dealing with that aspect too, because of course, we have to accept the fact that God can know the future, which means he knew he was going to create, and yet still give himself a free will to decide not to create. How do you combine those two? Who knows? Okay, but the fact is we have to believe both are true. And that goes back to the very question I raised at the beginning. Do you believe it's possible in the omnipotent God to know all things ahead of time and yet still give man a free will, uncoerced, uninfluenced by any divine power at all? It must be true. And that's what you have to accept. Only God knows how those things work together. Like only God knows what the Trinity is. We don't. We just put labels on it and say 3 persons in one God, whatever that means. Now, I don't mean to be sarcastic about that. I'm just saying that that's the best we can do, is put labels on it and hope that we've come close to what the Trinity really is. You see. So there's these mysteries of God that we're going to remain a mystery, and they may remain a mystery for eternity. Who knows whether God's going to reveal to us, whether we can understand it or not. Okay, because we're not God, that's for sure. So, and it may not be the territory that God wants us to go into, because we wouldn't understand it even if he told us. But you have to believe that both are true. That's the way the Bible presents itself to us. Okay? Because you can talk, if you can, understand the other side where you can say, excuse me, the big debates between Jacob Arminius and John Calvin or whoever, where, the Arminians just says, look, you might have what you think is the logical approach, wherein, you answer no to the question, can the omnipotent God both know the future and still give man a free will? And your answer is no. That may seem logical to you, okay? But you're just cut out the half of the Bible. Because this same God that you say is thinking so logically, like you think logically, is pleading with men to use their free will to come to him. And then if they don't come to him, it's their own fault, and he's not to be responsible. That's the kind of God that Scripture gives us. The other half of Scripture, okay? So that's a logical position, just as yours is logical, okay? So that's where we leave it. The bottom line is you have to believe that both are possible. End of discussion. Once you accept that, then all the problems go away. Well, they don't go away. They just, are put on the shelf, because it's not for us to figure it out. God knows it, and that's the way he runs the world. Even with himself, he runs the world that way. Because he's certainly not a determined being. The church says he has free will, so there's some kind of combination between God knowing all the future and God having a free will. The church doesn't go in to explain, well, here's how it works. Doesn't do that, because they don't know how it works. All they know is that both are true. That's it, period. So each time you see that spelled out in a doctrinal way, in the church. It just says, no, God wasn't forced to create. That's it. They know the implications of that, but they're not going to go into it with you. Okay. So, at any rate, that's where we're at with that. Okay. Doctor, where did the scientists that promote geocentrism get their order from? Who's behind it? Not sure if I understand this. Doctor, where did the scientists that promote geocentrism get their order from? Well, you don't have to. That's the whole thing about being a scientist. You don't have to have an order. You just collect data, and then you make a hypothesis about what this data means. And then if it survives scrutiny with your colleagues, then it could become a theory. And then after a while, if the theory doesn't have anybody that comes along and upsets it with another experiment, you may have it rise to the level above a theory, whatever that is, a fact. But there's hardly any facts in science. That's the first thing you find out after you're a scientist. They don't like to think of things as facts because why? Because there inevitably is going to come along another experiment that if they're wrong on the first experiment, that other experiment's going to find it. Because that's what these guys are paid for. Okay, this man A claims this, and he comes from Stanford. Well, is that going to make Stanford, have all the prestige and the money and the government grants and all that? Well, let's see if we can upset him, and we'll go do another experiment to show that his experiment was flawed. That happens all the time. Okay, and the only ones that survive are either those that are very close to the truth or are the truth. But it's a jungle out there. Okay, so but the ideal scientist is one who gathers data from his telescope, his microscope, his oscilloscope, whatever scope he has, and then he tries to connect all the dots and make a conclusion, which may or may not be right. Okay. And sometimes they're right, and they don't like them. They don't want it to be right. Like when Hubble saw the redshift of the galaxies and no blue shifts and concluded that, oh my gosh, this means Earth is in the center of the universe. What are we going to do? You see, that's collecting the data and knowing exactly where it leads to, but you don't want that conclusion. So you make up another theory to try to get out of it, to try to make the data fit into your theory instead of what it logically looks like. That happens all the time. Okay? So the only order they have is from the institution that hired them, the institution that wants to make its investors happy, and it's like there's a saying in institutions like this: you publish or perish. So you come in, you're hired as a scientist, you better publish some works and start making some claims, or you will perish. Nobody will hire you. Nobody cares about you because we're in it to make money. This is a capitalist society here. Okay, and if you're not going to make us money by publishing something, right or wrong, who cares? Take your best guess, take your best shot. That happens all the time. My wife was a scientist. She got her degree from Penn State University, worked in a laboratory, and found out that the laboratory makes up things all the time and writes papers on it, claiming that, so many mice died when we did this, and so many mice lived when we did this, and our conclusion is blah, 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 whatever. And why? Because they're after the grant money. Because the institution, the laboratory, is not going to survive unless they have the grant money. Because these things cost money. The machines they use, the techniques they use, the people they have to pay, who all got graduate degrees, you're talking about a lot of money, millions of dollars. Okay. And you got a government that's willing to give money to anybody. And the grant system never has to be paid back. Boy, if that wasn't a carrot leading the horses down the track, my goodness. So, the whole thing's built on whether we get our grant money or not. And so the boss is going to come into you someday. My wife can testify to this and say, so what's the timeline on your experiment for these mice taking bacteria in them? And, can you give us a day? Well, this is rather difficult. We're just having a hard time because our theory may be wrong that this drug is going to do this or that. And so we're really going to have to, test it again and again and again. Well, listen, little girl, we can't do that because the grant expiration date's coming up in 2 months. So we better have something to show them. That's the pressure they're under. Okay. So, there's a lot of politics in science. And the biggest politics in science is keep the Catholic Church under scrutiny, duress, draw your line in the sand. Don't let them come out from the cave and start preaching. That's number one rule. Okay? Because this institution won't go away. We think we conquered it here or there, and it just keeps going. It's like never mind. I was going to make a joke. The Energizer Bunny. That's what it seems like. It just never goes away. And, it's always in our face. And we're modernists now. We're enlightened from the Enlightenment. We're not living in the medieval ages anymore. Okay? We can make machines that can talk and think and do everything for us now. We can fly planes. And so, come on. We can't come under the Catholic Church again. So, yeah. Now, they're not going to come out and tell you that, okay? I'm the guy who's going to tell you that. But that's the reality of life. All right. At this time of the year, people tend to charge us with making Christmas on 25th December to attempt to convert the pagans, as it is supposedly falls close to a pagan feast day. How do I answer? Monsieur, lunchtime. So here's what you do. You get my book, okay, The Dates of Adam to Christ. Paperback book, I don't know, that thick. Good bedtime reading for you if you want to find out why we believe Jesus was born on December 25th, that is the correct date. And what happens with the pagans is they just want to copy us. That's all. That's all that's happening. So it's not a matter of Christmas copying the pagans. It's a matter of the pagans copying Christmas, the Christian Christmas. Okay? But if you want to know how we get there chronologically, genealogically, to December 25th, my book tells you. So go to robertsungenis.org, scroll down, go to books, and then scroll down, and you'll see it. Okay? All right. And by the way, there's like 4 different paths, chronological paths you can use to get to December 25th. Okay? All right. In Exodus 32:14, it says, the Lord repented of the evil which he thought to do to his people. So to who exactly should God show his repentance, and how is he doing evil if he is all good? Okay, so evil in that sense, the way that word is used in the Bible, it's talking about a punishment or calamity. Okay, because it's something that comes from your evil deeds, basically, is why God calls it an evil. But it's not the same connotation or sometimes the same word that is used when men are doing evil. Okay, there's a lot of words for men doing evil, This particular word can be understood as calamity, punishment, things like that. Okay. So I think, is that all that you asked? Yeah, that's all. Okay. I thought we were going to get into another discussion about God's free will versus his determined will. Okay. In the case of people suffering from scrupulousness, can it be considered that all private vows they make are probably invalid? I don't know. I mean, you'd have to know the what the person said, the motive, if they were crazy or not. Then you have to figure that out too. So there's a lot of factors that go in to making a vow and making it in the right forum or a legal context. Okay, because there's a lot of things that by themselves may be legit, but you can't do them in a court of law. Okay, because there's certain parameters that a court of law has for how you can present things, like present evidence, let's say. It can't be a surprise to the other side. They have to see it first. It has to be from a credible witness. Otherwise, the court will throw it out. All kinds of things go into determining whether what someone says is valid. I mean, somebody can write a will and be crazy and give all their belongings to their parrot. When the person who died has 10 children who are all good people, but this guy's crazy, gave it all to his parrot. Things like that happen in life, by the way. Okay, so the court's going to look at this and say, was this guy in his right mind? And what do you think the 10 children are going to do? They're going to get lawyers and they're going to come and plead with the court. Daddy was not in his right mind when he wrote this will. And the judge will, retract the will and divide it probably evenly among the 10 children, whatever was left. And the parent probably will be killed because the 10 children are going to get after him for making them go through all this to get, their rightful, willful money. Okay. Question. According to the book of Job, God gives the devil permission to torment Job. So does the devil and demons always need approval from God to do what they want? Well, in a certain sense, yes, that's true. That the devil is corralled by what God will allow him to do. So in that sense, God uses the devil. Okay. How this happens, we're not quite sure. I mean, we know there's no more discussion as there was in the book of Job between God and the devil. That ain't going to happen anymore. Okay. Because at that time, the devil had access. And that's no longer the case. He no longer has access. So that form of communication is over and done with. God probably sends his angels out to basically communicate with or do actions that limit the actions of the devil and his demons. Okay. So they're always active, because if the demons and the devil had it their way, their power would be unlimited and there would be no more salvation in the world. It'd be over. So the angels are constantly working, and God knowing where to send them, how long to send them, all that God knows, because he knows everything. So you angels go over here, you go over here, you do this, you do that, and let them know that where their parameters are. Now, why God would allow them to work is because the man's decided to be evil. And God has promised, if you decide to be evil deliberately, then I'll lead you more into your very sin, and that will be your punishment, and you're going to be surrounded by demons. And good luck with that. Okay, so that God's very serious about this. But that's how I believe that he sets the parameters on the devil's works. Now, one day, God's not going to send his angels out. Okay, and we find that in the book of the Apocalypse. You read a lot about the angels dealing with the demons in the book of the Apocalypse, but suddenly it stops. And that's when it says the devil is released from the abyss, and it comes to the earth for his little season, which is the release of the Antichrist, okay, at some time in the future. And that will be for a little season, and then the end will come. Jesus will come back for the second coming, and the world will be destroyed. But the point I'm trying to make here is that when the devil is released, there ain't going to be any angels helping us. Okay? It says the devil will go out to the four quarters of the earth, Gog and Magog, to deceive the nations. So when this guy comes, whenever he comes, that's what's going to happen. God withdraws, lets the devil come, and he wreaks havoc over the whole world, deceiving them, because he's not worried about, physical torture or wars or anything. He could care less about that. The more war there is, the less people he has to deceive. And that's why I don't worry about nuclear war. You hear that talk a lot today. That ain't going to happen. Okay? That's the last thing the devil wants, nuclear war, because that means there's less people to deceive that he can take down to hell with him, where misery loves company. Okay? So the best way for him to do this is to make it nice, hunky-dory for everybody. Everybody think, hey, great, things are just perking up, aren't they? Wow, we thought we had some big problems, and now look, everything's fine and dandy. Everybody's happy, and, life goes on, and it's great. That's what he wants. He wants people to think like that. Everything's fine. And they get deceived by their own, luxuries and commodities and good living and whatever. They can get anything they want. Because that will lull them to sleep so that he can deceive them even more. He doesn't want to have havoc, okay? Because the first thing that people are going to do is not turn to the devil. They're going to start saying their prayers to God. And that's the last thing he wants. He wants them to think he's God. And he's going to make them think that he's God because everything's going to be so fine and dandy by all the miracles that he does. So that's how I see it. All right. Is Protestantism a theological machine of apostasy? I think we had this yesterday. Not yesterday. Last week, Daniel. I think I already answered this. All right. Question regarding the papacy. I recently heard Orthodox apologist J. Dyer say to a caller, "Don't you know there was more than one see?" insinuating the Pope does not have supremacy. Well, if that's what Jay Dyer is talking about, then he doesn't know what he's talking about, okay? That's just absolutely ridiculous. So this is what happens when you decide to leave the Catholic Church because you see problems in it that you think are unsolvable or beyond the pale, and you go to another institution that's going to compete with the Catholic Church. This is what you're going to fall into. And he becomes a false prophet. That's what he is. Okay? So I'm warning you, stay away from it. Okay? Questions. After crucifixion, did Jesus descend into real hell or the waiting area of good souls? All right. So this is one of those areas of Catholic tradition that's very weak. And I talk about this in my commentary dealing with 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 18 to 21. And that would be in the fourth commentary. So if you want the details on this, that's where I would lead you. And my phone's ringing, and I'm not going to get it. Here's how we want to do this, in my opinion. Okay, this is my opinion because I see the flaws in the other interpretation. There's not many times that I do this with the Catholic Church's tradition, but this is one of those. And there may be one other one, but be prepared because I'm not going to say the same things that other people say on this because they don't exegete the scripture properly. This is a very difficult passage to exegete. I will admit that up front. 1 Peter 3, 18 to 21. But there's been a lot of interpretation given to it, and the one that's sticking now, I don't think is proper. It needs to be relooked at. So there's this belief that, the dead people who were godly people and died in the Old Testament go to this place of Hades, the good part of Hades, and they await Christ to rise from the dead. And after that, Christ is going to release them from this place that their souls have been waiting for thousands of years. That I don't believe is true. Okay, there is plenty of passages in the Old and New Testament that tell us that the souls that died in the Old Testament and all souls that died before Christ was crucified go to purgatory or heaven. Okay, they don't go to another place called Hades. Hades is sort of a misnomer also because sometimes it can refer to hell. Okay. At other times, it can refer to death. So it depends on the context that is telling us which one is the correct one. Same in the Old Testament. You have the word Sheol, which sometimes can be used for hell and sometimes can be used for death. And the context will help us make that distinction. Okay. When the New Testament wants to talk about the actual place of hell, it will use Gehenna, which is strictly hell. It's not the grave or death, or Tartarus. And it only uses Tartarus once. It uses Gehenna about, a dozen times. Hades is like, it used to be thought of as somewhere between heaven and hell. And that's why this concept of the souls who died in the Old Testament go to Hades, waiting for Christ to arise. You really can't get support from that from 1 Peter 3, 18 to 21. Okay? And when you read my commentary, you'll find out why. So no, I don't believe they went to Hades. I believe, like Abraham's soul is in heaven. Isaac's soul is in heaven before Jesus rose from the dead. Okay? So that's one thing. The other thing is that the ones that are in hell, which you can call Hades, are the unbelievers who have died in the Old Testament and are awaiting their final judgment at the general judgment. They're the ones that go to Hades, not the good souls. Okay? And that's at least fair. Why should the good souls be in this, quandary of being in Hades for thousands of years, for Pete's sake? And the bad souls are there too. That doesn't make sense. Okay? That's why the good souls go immediately to heaven or purgatory, and the bad souls go to Hades as you want to call it, a waiting place for the final, or you could just call it hell right now, and go and wait there for their final judgment, which is the general judgment, which they'll be cast into hell with their bodies. See, only the souls are in this Hades right now. And then they're going to be resurrected with new bodies that unite with their soul, and then they'll be sent to hell. Okay? And we can imagine how ugly those bodies are going to look. So they'll be in that state. I hate to laugh because it's very serious. They'll be in that state forever, or however long God keeps them in that state, because that's another possibility that he could terminate that punishment depending on how many sins they have. That's something the church has never really said definitively. But it makes sense that they would wait for the final judgment to get their bodies, and that's what's happening with the good souls that are in heaven, is they're waiting for Jesus to come back the second time so that he can give them their spiritual bodies that they'll live in forever in the new heaven and the new earth that God will recreate. But so when it says that Jesus went down to Hades, so his body's in the grave. So in his soul, he goes down. And what's he saying to these bad souls? He's saying, as you can see, I have triumphed over death, and your judgment is thus confirmed and will not change. See, because as far as heaven is concerned, everything's like open. It's like, will Jesus make it to the cross? Will he die? Will he be raised again on the third day? I mean, will the Father accept his offering on the cross and, then give us grace to live the rest of our lives and go to heaven? I mean, everything's contingent, you see. It's not like, and this is another mystery of our faith, is from prophecy, it all sounds like it's cut and dry. But when the Bible is describing these events, it's like all contingent, I mean, Judas has a free will to either betray or not betray Christ, and Christ treats it that way, as if his decision is his own decision, and yet, 2 Peter says, as it was determined. The book of Acts, chapter 2, says, as it was determined. So, I mean, wow, this is just fascinating, but it's hard to understand. But that's the way they're treating us, and that's why Jesus comes down to these people in Hades and says, your judgment is now secure. And he couldn't have said, the implication is he couldn't have said that unless he actually rose from the dead. It's one thing to predict, but it's another thing to actually go through it and make it accomplished. And those two things kind of butt heads in the Bible, but the accomplishment is needed to fulfill the prediction. And Jesus says, I have accomplished it. It is finished, like he said on the cross. It's finished. I've done it. And to say that as a man, wow. Because that's where he's speaking from at that time. And as a man, he comes to these souls in heaven, says, it's been accomplished. Your judgment is confirmed. And they're all crying and wailing, but that's what's happening there, you see. This is the crux of the cross, you might say. Will Jesus accomplish this? And once he does, everyone bows, no exceptions. And anyway, that's the way it goes. All right, so we got 5 minutes left here. And when was it within the public ministry of Jesus that the population understood that he was presenting himself as God to scribes and everyone at large? Well, he tried to hold this back as much as possible. So this is another one of those contingencies. because Jesus knew as a man that if he starts proclaiming, hey, I'm God, everywhere he went, hey, I'm God, he's going to lose his life real quick because he's got enemies. Right away, he's got enemies. Pharisees, Sadducees, Romans, even the populist people who just follow him because he gives them something to eat. Any one of them could turn on him. Okay? So it's very subtle how Jesus introduces himself as God. Most of it comes at the end of the Gospels, before he's crucified, of course, but toward the end, he lets out this information more and more and more. Okay? And to the point where he now wants to let it out to agitate the Pharisees and the Sadducees and everybody else so that they do try to kill him, you see. And yet, on the other hand, we see Jesus complaining to the Pharisees, why are you trying to kill me? And yet, on the other hand, he's got this whole thing devised with the Father and the Holy Spirit, of course, that you're only going to let it out a little bit at a time, because once you reach this threshold of letting it out, they're coming after you. Okay? And when does that happen? Well, for most of Jesus's ministry, he's in Galilee, which is north of the Red Sea. Okay? And that's where the Pharisees and Sadducees have some people, but most of them are in Jerusalem. Okay? And Jesus stays away from Jerusalem, practically his whole ministry. And then at the very end, he says, we must go to Jerusalem where the Son of Man must die. Okay, so he starts his trek down from Galilee up north and goes on the eastern side of the Sea of Galilee. So he doesn't run into Pharisees on the western side where they're more populated. Okay, and he only goes on the eastern side where a lot of it's desert. And, he's preserving himself so that when he wants to make sure he gets to Jerusalem, because he knows they're going to kill him there. All he has to say is, I'm God, in front of them, and that's it. It's over. Blasphemy. And that's more or less what he does when he gets to Jerusalem. But at the very end, he's got a week to go to live. And suddenly now he leaves Galilee, goes through the eastern desert, and then crosses the Jordan and comes to Jerusalem. And he knows he's got a week to live, because he knows these guys are rabid. They want to kill this Jesus because he's upsetting the whole Jewish religion. And it comes true. Within 7 days, he's dead. That's the moment he steps, 2 miles from Jerusalem, in Bethany, and what's the other place? Where the fig tree incident happens. Okay, that's in Bethany, and that's just a couple of miles from Jerusalem. So I think that's. Let me see. Yeah. So, and that's where you find Jesus presenting himself more as God, because that's, to the Jew, that's the ultimate sin. All right. Now, there were some places where Jesus, implied, that he was God in the early part of his ministry. Okay. But this only comes at the end for a specific reason, because he wants to go to the cross, because this is the way of salvation for the world, you see. So you get these two levels in the New Testament. One level where Jesus knows that these people are going to be doing something evil when they kill him, and yet when Peter tries to stop him from going, Jesus says, "Get thee behind me, Satan. For your ways are not the ways of God. I want to go to the cross. Don't you understand? This is your salvation." And that's the other level. And both of them levels are working at the same time. So that's where the Gospels are just like, oh my gosh, how can John or Matthew or Luke write on these two levels and not think that there's a contradiction here somewhere? Okay, well, this is the mind of God. That's why we know God wrote the Gospels, because the intricate webbing in and out is just absolutely fascinating. How he weaves it in and doesn't come out making a stupid mistake or a lie or an error, nothing. It just all so, it just congeals all so well. And scholars have just marveled over this, at least the ones that believe that the gospel writers wrote it. They just marvel over it. Okay, so that's why the book never dies. It's much greater than Shakespeare or Homer or anybody else could do. Way above them. Okay, as a matter of fact, that's where Shakespeare got his whole methodology for making his plays. If you ever watch Shakespeare's plays, he has, and movies today or plays today in modern society, they all do the same thing. Watch your movies the next time and look for it. You have the setting, okay? You have the characters introduced one by one. Sometimes some come early, some come late, but they got to be introduced, and their little idiosyncrasies, whatever they are, and they're sort of hinted at the beginning, okay? And then you have what they call the rising action. Something happens, some conflict happens, and it gets everybody interested in the movie or the play. Wow, what's going to happen next? You usually have a protagonist and an antagonist, introduced at this time. You see, that's part of the character development. But it's called rising action. And then you have confrontation. Yeah, the protagonist and the antagonist are going at it against each other. And that may go on for an hour. I mean, you sit in an hour and a half movie, and that confrontation between the protagonist and the antagonist may be going on for 45 minutes, an hour and 15 minutes, okay? And then you have what they call the climax. And that is when the protagonist and the antagonist meet together in their final fight, so to speak, and a winner is declared, a winner is determined. The protagonist or the antagonist. So usually in Western movies and plays and all that, it's the protagonist that wins. You very rarely find the antagonist, but you find more and more of those today, that the antagonist wins. And then you have what they call the aftermath. That is, because the protagonist has won, what are the results of that? Okay, and everybody's happy, celebrations, and his enemies are put in jail. That's aftermath. And then you have this thing called the resolution. That is, okay, so all this has happened. What is what they call the takeaway? What's the takeaway from this? And that's where you come in as the audience. You're supposed to figure out, well, what's the moral of the story, so to speak? Okay, because the author's not going to tell you. But you see, there's what? 7 steps. 7 steps, and you see the Gospels permeated with that. 7 steps, settings, character, confrontation, climax, aftermath, resolution, everywhere. And the Old Testament as well. Okay? Like we went over the story of Cain and Abel today. That has 7 steps to it, almost as if it was giving theater. Okay? The apocalypse is permeated with that. So, I could show you everywhere in Scripture where you see this theatrical presentation, so to speak, of the story. And then you have possibilities of plots, subplots to subplots, and that's what you see a lot in the Gospels. You see plots and subplots working out at the same time. Okay. It's just fascinating. And that's what fascinates me about Scripture is this intricacy that goes way beneath the surface. Anyway, it's 5 after 5, so I have to go. We will see you next week. December. No, actually, you won't see me. So I have to say bye for the next 2 weeks because our day happens to fall on a Wednesday, or Christmas and New Year's. So I'm going to miss you. So I hope you miss me. But we'll be back on January the 8th and start a new year. And hopefully we'll learn even more about our wonderful God and his son, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit, and just be good Christians for him, waiting for him to come back and complete all this glorious creation he's made. Anyway, God bless you. We'll see you next time. And if you could, leave a donation to our organization, Catholic Apologetics International, and that will help us keep going to next year. All right, so take care. God love you.